The ground in Montana in the summer of 1886 was hard as iron until you broke it open, and then it was dark and rich and cold, 6 inches down, even in July, even when the sun sat high and burning in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Astrid Kellgren had been breaking ground since before sunrise. She worked with a long-handled spade, driving it into the earth with the heel of her boot, turning the soil over in heavy slabs, then crouching to break the clods apart with her hands. She had been doing this for 3 hours. Her back ached from the base of her spine to her shoulder blades. Her palms had blistered, and the blisters had broken, and the raw skin beneath them had hardened into something that was almost not pain anymore. Almost. The hole was 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. By the time she was done, it would be 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, and it would be lined with straw and sawdust and wooden planks, and it would hold more food than most families in the Gallatin Valley would store in 3 years. She did not think about the pain. She thought about numbers. 600 pounds. That was the number she was working toward. 600 pounds of food beneath the floor of her cabin, packed and sealed and stored in the dark, where the temperature never dropped below 40 degrees and never rose above 55. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, cabbage, dried beans, smoked venison, preserved fruit, pickled vegetables, dried apples from her neighbor's orchard 3 miles up the valley. 600 pounds, 7 months. She did the arithmetic every morning when she woke up and every evening before she slept. It was the only arithmetic that mattered. Her neighbor Ruth Hansen, whose farm was a half-mile to the east, had walked over in June to watch Astrid work and had stood at the edge of the garden with her arms folded across her chest and a look on her face that Astrid recognized without needing to see it clearly. The look of a person watching something they could not quite decide was impressive or insane. "You're going to break yourself before winter even comes," Ruth had said. Astrid had not looked up from her planting. "Someone has to be ready," she said. That was all. Ruth walked home. Astrid kept planting. She had come to Montana from Sweden in 1882 with her husband Lars, who was 28 years old and certain of everything. He was a tall man, Lars Kellgren, with a broad chest and hands that could grip a plow handle for 10 hours without shaking. And he had grown up in a part of Sweden where the famines had not reached where the winters were hard, but manageable, where the worst thing that could happen in February was a week of poor hunting and a lean pantry. He had never known real hunger. That was the thing about Lars. He was a good man, a kind man, a man who worked hard and loved his wife and meant to build something lasting in the new country. But he had never sat at a table where the bread was gone and the pot was empty and there was nothing left to put in front of the children. And so he had never understood in his body, in the deep, wordless part of a person that knows things before the mind catches up, that hunger was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence. Astrid had known hunger. She had grown up in a part of Sweden where her grandmother's stories were not history, but memory, where the famine of 1867 was not something that had happened to other people in another time, but something that had happened to this family in this village on this specific piece of ground. She had grown up understanding that the distance between enough and not enough was measured not in miles but in months, and that the months that mattered most were the ones that came after you thought winter was almost over. She had tried to explain this to Lars. He had listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and his serious blue eyes, and then he had smiled and squeezed her hand and said, "This is Montana, Astrid, not Sweden. We have good land. We'll be fine." They were fine the first 3 years. The summers were long and golden, and the soil turned up rich and dark under the plow, and the cattle they bought on credit grew fat on the valley grass, and Lars built their cabin with his own hands, and Astrid planted a garden that fed them through 2 winters without difficulty. The third winter was different. The winter of 1885 to 1886 did not announce itself. It arrived in November like an ordinary winter, with ordinary snow and ordinary cold, and nothing about the first week suggested what was coming. Lars looked at the sky in December and said it would break soon. He said the same thing in January. In February, when the snow was 4 feet deep and the temperature had not risen above zero. In 3 weeks, he looked at their stores and said they were running low, but it would be fine. He would go hunting. They had time. He went out on the morning of February 23rd. Astrid was pregnant. 4 months. She had not told Lars yet, waiting for the right moment, waiting until she was sure. She watched him pull on his coat and his boots and take his rifle from beside the door, and she said, "Be careful, the sky looks wrong." Lars kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before dark," he said. A storm came up 2 hours after he left. One of those Montana blizzards that materialize out of nothing, out of a sky that was gray but manageable 1 hour, and then white and roaring the next, dropping visibility to 10 feet, dropping the temperature another 20 degrees in the time it takes to walk from the barn to the cabin door. Lars did not come back before dark. He did not come back the next day or the day after that. Astrid waited 3 days alone in the cabin, with the fire burning and the food running lower, and the storm pressing against the walls like something alive. She could not go out. The snow was chest deep in places, and the cold was the kind that kills you before you realize you're in trouble. The kind that makes you sleepy, first, then peaceful, then gone. On the fourth day, when the storm broke enough to see past the tree line, she went out. She found him 2 miles from the cabin in a shallow depression behind a stand of pine where he must have tried to shelter from the wind. He was on his seat, his knees drawn up, his face turned away from her. The rifle was still in his hand. He had made it 2 miles before the cold took him. She did not cry. She stood in the snow for a long time looking at him, and she did not cry. Not because she did not love him. She had loved Lars Kallgren with everything she had, with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself or make speeches, but simply shows up every morning and does the work. She did not cry because she was too cold and too hungry and too far from anything to spend whatever was left in her on tears. She memorized his face, the angle of his shoulder, the way his hand still gripped the rifle like he was ready to stand up. Then she walked home. She lost the baby 3 weeks later. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She got through it alone in the cabin in the last weeks of a winter that seemed to have decided it would never end. And when it was over, she lay on the bed for 2 days and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. A husband, a child, a winter. On the third day, she got up. She made herself eat the last of the beans. She melted snow for water. She sat at the table where Lars used to sit across from her, and she did the arithmetic that was going to define every decision she made for the rest of her life in Montana. How much food do you need to survive 7 months without leaving this cabin? She worked it out on a piece of paper with a stub of pencil. Calories, pounds, variety for nutrition. She was not a woman who had been educated in any formal sense, but she had grown up in a household where survival was calculated the way other households calculated money, where her grandmother had kept mental ledgers of food stores the way a banker keeps ledgers of accounts. She had been doing this arithmetic since she was a child. She knew how to do it. The number she arrived at was 600 pounds. 600 pounds of the right foods stored correctly would keep one person alive for 7 months. Not comfortable, not well-fed, alive. And if winter only lasted 5 months, or 4, she would have food to spare, food to share, food that did not spoil, but simply waited in the dark beneath her floor. She folded the piece of paper and put it in her apron pocket. Then she started planning. Spring came late that year. When the snow finally melted, the valley was littered with the evidence of what the winter had done. Dead cattle in the field's legs stiff toward the sky, fencing buried and broken under drifts that had not fully melted even in May, gardens that had been planted too shallow and frozen solid before anything could be harvested. Astrid walked every inch of her claim in the first week of May and made decisions. She would triple her garden, not grow what she needed, but grow what she could store. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, cabbage, crops that went underground, crops that kept. She would plant from the eastern fence line to the western every square foot of ground that would take a seed. She would hunt all summer. Every deer she could shoot, every elk, every animal that could be smoked and dried and hung from the rafters of the small smokehouse she would build from the scrap lumber behind the barn. She would hunt in June and July and August when the hunting was good and the smoking weather was warm and dry, not in February when she was desperate and the weather was deadly. She would build the root cellar, not the shallow pit they had managed before, but something serious. 8 feet down into the cold Montana clay that held its temperature year-round, lined with straw and sawdust and timber, sealed against the freeze and the rot both. She would do all of this herself because there was no one else. She started digging the first week of May, before she planted the garden, before she built the smokehouse, before she did anything else. She started with the foundation of everything, the hole in the ground that was going to keep her alive. She was 4 feet deep in her root cellar in the second week of June when she heard the sound of a carriage coming up the track toward her cabin. She did not look up. She knew who it was before the wheels stopped. She had heard that carriage before on the road into town, the sound of matched horses and iron-bound wheels on packed earth, the sound of money moving through the valley. Mrs. Dorothea Winslow of the Winslow Ranch came to call on a Tuesday morning in the middle of June, wearing a dress that had been made in Boston and shoes that had no business being within 10 miles of a working farm. She was 38 years old, handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair coiled under a hat that would have cost Astrid a month of wages, and she had the bearing of a woman who had never in her life had to decide between two things she needed, because she could only afford one. She stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down at Astrid in the hole and said with genuine curiosity rather than cruelty, "What on earth are you doing?" Astrid drove the spade into the earth. "Building a root cellar," she said. "You already have a root cellar. Not deep enough." Dorothea looked at the hole, at the planks and straw and tools laid out beside it, at the 3 crates of potatoes sitting on the cabin porch waiting to be stored. She looked at the garden that stretched across what had once been open ground, the rows of newly planted vegetables extending farther than anything the cabin had ever seen. "My husband tells me," Dorothea said carefully, "that you've been buying every potato and turnip in the valley, that you've been hunting since June, that you have plans to smoke meat all summer and store enough food down here to last until spring." Astrid looked up then. Her ice-blue eyes met Dorothea's dark ones without apology or explanation. "Your husband is right," she said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "Then people are talking, Mrs. Calgren. They say the Swedish widow has lost her mind with grief. They say she's hoarding food like an animal preparing for something that will never happen." "Something happened last winter," Astrid said. "My husband went out hunting in February because we were running low, and he froze to death 2 miles from this cabin. I found his body 3 days after the storm broke." She paused, looking at the dirt on her hands. "I am not doing that again." Dorothea's composure flickered for just a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Then her expression settled back into its familiar architecture of confidence and mild concern. "That is a terrible thing," she said. "But surely the answer isn't to spend the summer burying yourself alive under your own floor. The answer is to trust your neighbors, to trust the community, to trust that civilization will provide. We have trains now, telegraphs. My husband has 50,000 head of cattle in this valley. You cannot run out of food in Montana in 1886. Astrid went back to digging. "You can't eat telegraphs," she said. "And cattle freeze." "I've seen it." Dorothea watched her for another moment, then adjusted her hat and turned back toward the carriage. "When spring comes and you're sitting on a mountain of rotting vegetables," she said, "I hope you'll have the good sense to know you were wrong." She drove away down the track, the matched horses moving easily, the carriage wheels leaving 2 clean parallel lines in the dust of the road. Astrid watched her go. Then she drove the spade into the earth again and went back to work. What Astrid did not know, what she could not have known, was what happened at the Winslow Ranch that evening. Dorothea told her husband Reginald about the Swedish widow with the vegetable pit, her tone light, her meaning clear. Here was a woman undone by grief and doing something unnecessary and a little embarrassing with her sorrow. Reginald Winslow was a big man, a practical man, a man who had built his 50,000 head operation from a single herd of 200 and had not done it by ignoring information he didn't like. He listened to his wife's account of Astrid Karlgren and her root cellar and her 600 pounds of food with the same attention he gave to every piece of information that came his way. Then he set down his after-dinner glass and said, "Tell Greer to buy 2 months of dry goods before September. Flour, beans, salt, pork." Dorothea looked at him. "You think she's right? I think she's not wrong," Reginald said. "And it doesn't cost us anything to be careful." Dorothea returned to her needlework. Reginald picked up his glass. But Reginald Winslow, for all his practical intelligence, made one mistake. He told his ranch manager Greer to handle it, and Greer, who had been managing the Winslow operations purchasing for 6 years, and who knew that dry goods were a poor investment of capital compared to the price being offered for young cattle, that fall decided that Mr. Winslow probably meant to say he should buy more beef on the hoof. The order was placed. The cattle were purchased. The dry goods were not. No one told Reginald. And Reginald, with 50,000 head of cattle to think about, and a ranch that stretched across 100,000 acres in accounts in 3 different banks did not check. In July, Astrid shot her first deer. It was a young buck, not large but clean and healthy, and she dressed it herself in the field and carried it back to the cabin in 2 trips the way her father had taught her in Sweden when she was 8 years old. She built the smokehouse from the scrap lumber behind the barn in 4 days, a small, solid structure with a tight roof and a smoke hole she could control, and she spent 3 days cutting the venison into strips thin enough to dry evenly, rubbing each strip with salt and black pepper, hanging them in rows on the wooden racks she had built inside. She shot another deer in July, a third in August, an elk in September that provided more meat than the 3 deer combined, an enormous animal that she tracked for 2 days before she brought it down in a ravine 6 miles from the cabin, and she spent the better part of a week processing and smoking everything that could be smoked. Her hands by August were not the hands of a woman who had spent the previous summer doing ordinary farm work. They were tougher and darker and more capable, marked by the tools she used and the work she did. The blisters from May had become callous. The ache in her back had become a background condition she no longer registered. She rose before light and worked until she couldn't see, and in the evenings, she sat at the table and did her arithmetic by candlelight. 340 pounds, she wrote in August. 260 to go. She picked wild berries from the hillsides above the cabin through July and August, cooking them down into preserves that she sealed in glass jars with wax. She pickled cucumbers and cabbage and beets in brine strong enough to last through spring. She dried apple slices from old Hendrickson's orchard, thin translucent rounds laid out on boards in the sun until they were brittle and sweet and would keep for a year without spoiling. Every pound that went into the pit was a calculation. She was not storing food randomly. She was building a nutritional architecture designed for maximum survival per pound of weight, per cubic foot of space. Calories, variety, shelf stability. The arithmetic her grandmother had done in her head for 60 years. Grandmother Sigrid came in September. She was 83 years old, nearly blind, traveling from her son's farm near Helena to see how the Swedish widow was managing. She made the journey in a neighbor's wagon, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon, moving slowly up the porch steps with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has learned that the ground is not to be trusted. But her mind was entirely clear, and when Astrid lifted the trap door in the cabin floor and showed her what was in the pit, the old woman's face changed in a way that Astrid recognized because she had seen it before in the faces of people who had found what they had been looking for. She crouched at the edge of the opening, feeling the cold air that rose from the darkness below. "This is how we survived in the old country," Grandmother Sigrid said. "Not by trusting weather, not by trusting governments or neighbors or markets, by trusting what we put away ourselves." They sat at the table that evening while the sun went down over the valley, and Grandmother Sigrid told Astrid what she had never told her son, what she had never told anyone who had not already lived through something similar. "The famine of 1867 killed 100,000 people in Sweden," the old woman said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of someone recounting established history, not the voice of someone who had watched her mother die. "I was 30 years old. I watched my mother and 2 of my sisters die. The winter that killed them lasted 7 months, October to May. People were eating leather by February, things I will not describe to you even now." She looked at Astrid across the table. "You store for 7 months," she said. "That is not too much, that is the minimum. The ones who die are always the ones who thought winter would be shorter than it was. They always think it will break in March. Sometimes it breaks in May." She stayed 4 days. She checked the smokehouse and the garden and the packed rows of preserves on the cabin shelves. She watched Astrid work without offering to help because she could see that help was not what was needed. What was needed was witness. Someone who understood what this kind of preparation meant, who had the long memory to know why it mattered. On the 4th morning, Astrid helped her into the neighbor's wagon and stood in the road while the wagon pulled away toward Helena. She did not know it was the last time she would see the old woman standing up. The mocking did not come only from Dorothea Winslow. Reverend Albrecht, who kept the Lutheran church in the valley town of Meridian, preached a sermon in August about the virtue of trusting in providence. He did not name Astrid, but the valley was small, and the story of the Swedish widow's root cellar had traveled in both directions along every road by midsummer, and everyone in the congregation understood who the sermon was for. "Trust in the Lord your provision," Reverend Albrecht said from his pulpit. Lay not up earthly stores in excess while your neighbors go without. Astrid, who had not attended church since February, heard about the sermon from Ruth Hansen, who delivered the account with the carefully neutral face of someone who had not quite decided what she thought about it. Did he say anything about who would feed those neighbors if there was nothing to share, Astrid asked. Ruth Hansen did not have an answer for that. Walter Pruitt, who ran the general store in Meridian, had a different complaint. He was a man who understood inventory and liked to control it, and the Swedish widow's systematic purchasing of his dried goods through the summer had disrupted his usual patterns of supply and demand. "Can't keep selling you 100 pounds of beans at a time," Pruitt told her in July. "Other customers need beans too. I'll pay $1 above your usual price for every 100 pounds, Astrid said. Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man whose principles in his income had just found themselves on opposite sides of an argument. He sold her the beans, but he told the story for the rest of the summer at the counter and at the feed store and at the post office about the Swedish widow who was buying the Valley Dry. "She's got enough food down there to feed an army," he told anyone who would listen. "Either she's gone crazy with grief or she knows something we don't." Most people in the valley had decided on the former explanation. Astrid let them think what they liked. She had 600 pounds to reach and a winter coming and no patience for the arithmetic of other people's opinions. By the middle of October, the pit beneath her floor held 580 pounds of provisions. She spent the last 2 weeks of October bringing it to 640, a little above her target, a margin she had not planned but was grateful for. She made her final count on the last day of October. Potatoes 140 pounds, turnips and carrots 90 pounds, cabbage 60 pounds packed in brine, dried beans 80 pounds, smoked venison and elk 110 pounds, preserved fruit and pickles 75 pounds, dried apples 30 pounds, salt pork flour cornmeal 55 pounds, 640 pounds. She added the numbers twice and got the same answer both times. Then she closed the ledger and set it on the shelf above the fireplace and went to bed. The first snow came on November 9th. She woke before dawn and lay still in the darkness and listened to the silence that only comes with snow, the particular muffled quiet that the world puts on when it is covered. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the white that had settled over the garden. The garden she had spent 5 months building, in the garden she would not see again until April. Maybe May. The snow was 8 inches deep. It had the look of snow that had not finished falling. She dressed and went to the barn and fed the horse and the 2 goats she had kept through the summer. She checked the smokehouse, though there was nothing left to check, everything already in the pit. She walked around the cabin and looked at the sky to the north, which was the gray-white color of more weather coming. Then she went inside and lifted the trap door in the floor and looked down into the darkness where 640 pounds of food sat waiting in the cold and the still air. She did not count it again. She did not need to. She let the trapdoor down. The latch caught with a solid sound. Outside, the snow kept falling. It had been 8 months since she had found Lars in the field, frozen and still with his rifle in his hand. 8 months since she had come home and lain on the bed and stared at the ceiling and understood, in the way that you only understand things that have cost you everything, to learn that the world did not care about reasonable expectations. That winter did not consult anyone's plans before deciding how long it would last. She sat down in the chair by the fire, the same chair where Lars used to sit across from her, and she let herself be still for a moment. She was ready, not because she was lucky, or because someone had helped her, or because the valley had decided to take her seriously. She was ready because she had spent 8 months making herself ready, 1 pound at a time, 1 day at a time, doing the arithmetic that no one else wanted to do, and accepting the answer even when it required everything she had. The snow fell outside the cabin walls. The fire burned. Beneath the floor in the cold, dark pit that went 8 feet down into the Montana clay, 640 pounds of food waited. Astrid Karlgren looked at the fire and did not think about what the winter would bring. She already knew. The second snow came 4 days after the first. It did not come the way the first snow had come, quietly in the night, laying itself down like something apologetic. This one came from the north in the middle of the afternoon, when the sky had been gray all morning and the temperature had been dropping since before sunrise, and it arrived with wind. Real wind. The kind that doesn't push against you but through you, the kind that finds every gap in a coat and every crack in a wall, and reminds you that warmth is not a given, but a thing you have to fight for and maintain and defend against the cold that is always waiting just outside. Astrid was in the barn when it hit. She felt the pressure change a few minutes before the snow arrived, that drop in the air that animals feel and most people have forgotten how to read. She finished forking hay to the horse, latched the barn door with the heavy iron bar, rather than just the latch, and made it back to the cabin with the first real gust hitting her sideways as she pushed through the door. She stood inside and listened to it build. By evening, the wind was driving snow horizontal past the window, and by midnight she could hear the drifts forming against the north wall of the cabin, the soft hiss and pack of accumulating snow, the particular sound of winter deciding to be serious. She put an extra log on the fire and went to sleep. This was the pattern she had established, and she kept to it through the first weeks of November with the discipline of someone who understands that routine is not comfort, but armor. Rise before light. Feed the animals. Eat a measured breakfast from the stores she kept in the cabin, rather than the pit, the working supply she had set aside for daily use. Do what work could be done. Eat a measured dinner. Sleep. She was not waiting for winter to end. She was simply living inside it the way her grandmother had taught her, the way the old country had forced people to learn. Winter was not an interruption of life. It was a season of life with its own demands and its own pace and its own arithmetic. You met it on its own terms, or you did not meet it well. Outside, the Gallatin Valley was going quiet in the way that valleys go quiet under serious snow. The road into Meridian, which had been passable into mid-November most years, drifted over in the first week of December and did not open again. The ranches that spread across the benchlands and river bottoms had pulled their operations inward, their crews close to the barns, their cattle gathered toward the sheltered draws. But the cattle were already in trouble. The cold came with December. Not the cold of an ordinary Montana winter, which was hard enough and demanded respect. This was something different, something that arrived in the second week of December and did not leave temperatures dropping to 20 below zero and staying there, then dropping further, 25 below, 30 below. The thermometer on Astrid's porch reading numbers that she checked twice because she did not want to believe them the first time. 38 below on the morning of December 19th. She wrote it in the margin of her ledger, the same ledger where she tracked her food stores because it seemed like a number that should be recorded somewhere. Then she dressed in every layer she owned, wrapped a wool scarf around her face until only her eyes were showing, and went out to the barn. The horse was alive, standing in the center of the stall with his head down, his breath making thick clouds in the air. The two goats were pressed together in the corner, sharing heat. She forked fresh hay, broke the ice on the water trough with a hammer, carried 2 pails of water from the cabin, where she had been keeping a pot on the fire through the night. The walk from the barn to the cabin was 40 feet. She could feel the cold through her boots before she reached the door. She thought about the cattle on the benchlands above the valley. She thought about the Winslow operation, 50,000 head, spread across 100,000 acres with no shelter that could hold numbers like that, no way to bring them in, no plan for cold, that settled in and did not move. She thought about what happens to an animal when the temperature drops below what its body can manage, when even the thick winter coat is not enough insulation against air that cold, when the ground is too hard and frozen for them to paw down to grass, and there is nothing to eat and nothing to burn. She thought about it once and then put it away. There was nothing she could do about Winslow's cattle. The sound started on the night of December 23rd. She was asleep when the first one went, and the sound brought her upright in bed. Before she was fully awake, her hand reaching for the rifle propped against the wall before her conscious mind had caught up with her body. A crack like a gunshot, sharp and clean and enormous, from somewhere in the tree line above the cabin. She sat still listening, her heart loud in the quiet that followed. Then another one. Then a third. She understood after a moment. The cold had gotten into the trees, into the water, in the wood cells, and the freezing was happening faster than the wood could accommodate. The sap was turning to ice and expanding, and the trunks were splitting apart under the pressure, the sound carrying through the frozen air like rifle shots in the dark. She lay back down and pulled the blanket up and listened to the trees exploding in the cold. It went on for 2 hours, then it stopped, and the silence that followed was the deepest silence she had ever heard, the silence of a world that had gone too cold for anything to move in it. In the morning, she counted 11 trees on the ridge above the cabin that had split. Some of them were old growth, 2 feet across the trunk. The cold had cracked them open like they were nothing. She wrote that in the ledger too. The reports from the valley reached her in fragments, carried by the occasional traveler who made it through the drifts to her door asking for directions or shelter or both. A ranch hand from the Henderson place who showed up on a Thursday in late December with ice in his beard and a look in his eyes that she recognized. A man who had seen something he was still making sense of. He told her about the cattle. They were dying on the benchlands above the river, he said. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Standing in the open because there was nowhere to go, the drifts too deep to move through the draws that should have provided shelter already packed full with snow. They were freezing where they stood, some of them legs locking up, going down, not getting up again. The ones that survived the night were dying the next day from starvation because there was no grass, had not been grass for weeks. Nothing to eat under 6 feet of snow. He said it in a flat voice, the voice of a man who has been working cattle his whole life and knows what he is watching and cannot do anything about it. How many, Astrid asked? He shook his head. Don't know. A lot. More every morning. She gave him a cup of hot coffee from the pot on the stove and a half-pound of smoked venison wrapped in cloth and pointed him toward the road south. He thanked her without meeting her eyes and went back out into the cold. She stood at the window and watched him go. 50,000 head. The number that Dorothea Winslow had said, like a promise, like evidence that Montana could not fail, that civilization had arrived and was sufficient. 50,000 head of cattle grazing across 100,000 acres. She wondered how many were still alive. January came and the cold did not break. 40 below on the morning of January 8th. She wrote it down. 40 below is the temperature at which exposed skin freezes in under a minute, at which the lungs ache with every breath, at which the world outside becomes genuinely, immediately lethal in a way that strips away any romanticism about winter and leaves only the naked fact of it. She went to the barn and back and did not linger. She had organized the interior of her days with the precision of a person who understands that discipline is warmth, that routine generates a kind of heat all its own, that the worst thing you can do in a long winter is let the structure of your hours dissolve into waiting. She mended harness leather. She rechinked the gaps in the cabin walls where the cold was seeping through. She read the 2 books she owned slowly, a few pages at a time. She maintained her ledger. She ate her measured portions and did not eat more. This was harder than she had expected. Not because she was desperately hungry, not yet, but because cold makes the body want fuel, makes the stomach loud and insistent in a way that summer never does. And the gap between what her body wanted and what she was allowing herself was a constant negotiation that required attention. She gave herself an extra half cup of beans on the coldest nights and called it a medical decision. In the ledger under January 15th, she wrote 487 pounds remaining. She was on schedule, slightly better than schedule because she had been disciplined, because she had not eaten more than she had planned, because the arithmetic was holding. She ran the numbers for the rest of winter the way she did every few weeks, checking her progress against the calendar. If winter ended in March, she would have enough to share with 3 families. If winter ended in April, she would have enough to share with 1. If winter lasted until May, as grandmother Sigrid had said it could, she would have enough to keep herself alive barely, with nothing to spare. She looked at the sky every morning. The sky was not interested in her arithmetic. The first family came in late January. The Millers, whose farm was 4 miles north along the valley road, arrived on a Thursday afternoon, all 6 of them in the wagon, which was a measure of how serious things were because the road was barely passable, and driving a loaded wagon over 4 miles of drifted track in January cold was not something you did unless staying home was worse. Jacob Miller knocked on the door with the careful knock of a man who knows he is asking for something significant. "We're running low," he said when Astrid opened the door. "The children are hungry." He was a proud man, Jacob Miller, a man who had farmed his own land for 12 years and had never asked a neighbor for anything he could not eventually repay. The asking cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he did not look directly at her when he spoke. "Come in," she said. She brought up from the pit what she could reasonably give: 20 pounds of potatoes, 10 pounds of dried beans, 5 pounds of smoked venison, a jar of preserved pears. She set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, doing the arithmetic, automatically filing away the new number. 6 children, she said. "This is enough for 2 weeks. Come back in 2 weeks." Jacob Miller looked at the food on the table. He looked at the trap door in the floor that led to the pit. He looked at Astrid. People said you were crazy, he said, buying up everything, digging that hole under your floor. He paused. I told my wife they were probably right. Astrid began wrapping the food in cloth so it would travel. What do you think now, she asked. Miller was quiet for a moment. I think I owe you an apology, he said. She handed him the bundle. You owe me 2 weeks, she said. Come back in 2 weeks and I'll give you more. After the Millers came the Petersons. After the Petersons came the family whose name she did not know, 3 adults and 4 children who had walked 7 miles through thigh-deep drifts because they had heard through the particular grapevine of desperate people who share information about survival the way other people share gossip that the Swedish widow on the South Road had food. She fed them. She gave them what she could and sent them home and stood at the window after they left and looked at the white world outside and did her arithmetic. The pit now held 412 pounds. She had planned for herself alone. She had not planned for 11 families, and the families were still coming. She could feel the calculations shifting beneath her, the way ground shifts in a spring thaw, the solid thing becoming uncertain. She sat down at the table with her ledger and her pencil, and she worked through it. If she continued at the current rate of giving, she would run out in February. If she cut her own portions further, she could extend that into March. If she rationed more tightly, more carefully, measuring every portion against what each family genuinely needed to survive, rather than what they might prefer to have, she could perhaps reach April. May was not in the arithmetic anymore. She put the pencil down. The night before Dorothea Winslow came to her door was the hardest night. It was the first week of February, and the pit held 380 pounds. And Astrid sat at the table after supper, after her 2 spoonfuls of beans and her portion of dried venison that was smaller than what she had been allowing herself in January, and she looked at the trap door in the floor, and she did what she had not let herself do before. She thought about stopping. Not stopping feeding the families who came not exactly, but rationing more strictly, giving less, sending people away sooner, keeping more in the pit for herself enough to make it through May, if it came to that, enough to not end up like Lars, not enough food going out into the cold to find more and not coming back. She was good at arithmetic. She ran the numbers carefully. If she stopped giving entirely starting tonight, she had enough food to last herself until the end of May with a small margin. She would be thin, but she would be alive. She would make it to spring. She would plant her garden again and rebuild her stores and survive. If she continued at the current rate of giving, she might not make it to April. She sat with both of those numbers for a long time. The fire burned. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls with the patient, impersonal pressure of something that does not need to hurry because it has already surrounded you. She thought about Lars, who had not had enough food and had gone out into a storm to find more and had not come back. She thought about grandmother Sigrid, who had watched her mother and her sisters die while people who had stored enough food had closed their doors. She thought about the 6 children in the Miller wagon, the youngest one asleep against her mother's shoulder, the particular slack weight of a child who is not getting enough to eat the face that is simultaneously too young and too old. She thought about who she was, not who she had been before February of last year, before the storm, before Lars, before everything. Who she was now after 8 months of digging and smoking and salting and calculating, after the summer of preparation that the whole valley had called insane. What had all of that been for, if not for this? What was the point of the food in the pit, if not to be used when people needed it? The ones who die, grandmother Sigrid had said, are always the ones who thought it couldn't happen here. The ones who close their doors, Astrid thought, are something else, a different kind of dead. She got up from the table. She lifted the trap door and climbed down into the pit and stood in the cold dark with the smell of earth and root vegetables and smoked meat and preservation all around her. She ran her hand along the rows of stored food, counting by touch in the dark. 380 pounds. She climbed back up. She would give until she could not give anymore, and she would ration herself below what was comfortable, and she would trust that spring would come before the pit was empty. She could not guarantee that. She did not know that. But she knew who she was, and she knew what the food was for, and she knew that closing the trap door against hungry children was not something she could do and remain herself. She put another log on the fire and went to bed. Dorothea Winslow came on the morning of February 11th. She did not come in the carriage. The carriage could not have made it through the drifts on the road through 6 feet of snow, packed hard by weeks of wind. She came on horseback, which told Astrid everything she needed to know before she even opened the door, because Dorothea Winslow did not ride horseback in February. Dorothea Winslow rode in a carriage with matched horses and a driver dressed for arriving, not for traveling. The woman who dismounted at Astrid's porch was wearing a wool scarf over her hair in place of the Boston hat. Her coat was practical, not fashionable. Her face when she unwound the scarf was thinner than it had been in June. Not dangerously thin, not yet, but on the way. The beginning stages of a body that is not getting what it needs, the sharpening of the cheekbones, the slight hollowness beneath them. Astrid recognized it. She had seen it in the mirror that morning. Mrs. Colgren. Dorothea's voice was different. Stripped of its drawing room brightness, the particular carrying quality that Boston education gave to certain vowels. What was left was just a voice. We're running out of food. The supply wagons can't get through. The hunting parties come back empty. Reginald's cattle. She stopped. She looked away for a moment, then back. We have perhaps 2 weeks of flour left. The sugar is already gone. Astrid opened the door wider. Come in. The warmth hit Dorothea like something physical. She stood in the doorway for a moment, swaying slightly, her body adjusting to a temperature it had not felt in weeks. Her eyes moved around the interior of the cabin, the fire burning steadily, the dried meat hanging from the rafters, the jars of preserved fruit on the shelves, the trap door in the floor, the evidence of preparation she had called foolish 6 months ago, now the most valuable thing in the Gallatin Valley. My children are hungry, Dorothea said. She said it the way people say things that cost them something to say, without inflection, stripped down to the bare fact. They're starting to look the way hungry children look. I know you know what I mean. Astrid did know. She had seen it in the Miller children. In the Peterson baby, in the face of the youngest child from the family, whose name she still did not know. She walked to the trap door and lifted it and climbed down into the pit. She came back up with 30 pounds of potatoes, a jar of preserved pears, and 8 pounds of smoked venison. She set them on the table and looked at them for a moment, the numbers rearranging themselves automatically in the back of her mind. 322 pounds remaining. This is 2 weeks, she said. Come back in 2 weeks. Dorothea stared at the food, then at Astrid. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I told everyone you were mad, she said finally. I told Reginald, I told the Reverend, I told everyone I spoke to. I laughed at you. She paused. I stood in this doorway and watched you dig that hole, and I thought you had lost your mind with grief, and I went home and laughed about it at dinner. Astrid pushed the food toward her. Your children didn't laugh at me, she said. I won't let them starve because their mother was wrong. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was one that Astrid did not try to name. There are things that happen to a person's face when they have been shown a specific kind of grace that they know they do not deserve, and those things are complicated and not entirely comfortable to witness. What happened to Reginald? Astrid said. It was not quite a question. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. He is not well, she said. That was all she said, and Astrid did not push. She helped Dorothea bundle the food for the ride back, and she stood on the porch in the cold and watched the woman mount her horse and ride back down the drifted track toward the road. Then she went inside and opened the ledger and updated the number. Reginald Winslow had not been well for some time. The accounting of what winter had done to his operation had begun in December and had not stopped each week's tally worse than the last, the numbers of dead cattle climbing past the point where they were losses and becoming something else entirely. Catastrophe. Not a business setback, but the erasure of everything he had built over 20 years. He had discovered in January, when he finally sat down with his ranch manager Greer to understand the full scope of what had happened, that the order he had given in October, the order for dry goods and preserved food as a precaution, had never been filled. Greer had redirected the funds into cattle purchases. Greer had decided, based on 20 years of experience managing livestock operations in Montana, that the boss probably meant cattle when he said provisions. Reginald had looked at Greer across the desk in his office and had said nothing for a very long time. Then he had said, "Get out." He sat alone in his office after Greer left with the accounting spread out in front of him and the cold pressing through the thick walls of the house that Dorothea had furnished with Boston furniture and Boston drapes and Boston confidence in the permanent solidity of things. He had known. That was what he could not get past. He had heard the story of the Swedish widow and her root cellar, and unlike everyone else in the valley, he had not dismissed it. He had recognized the logic of it. He had given the order. He had simply not followed through on the order himself, had handed it to someone else, had assumed that giving an instruction was the same as seeing it done. The Swedish widow had done the work herself. Every pound of it, every day of it. No manager, no delegation, no assumption that the thing would happen because she had said it should happen. She had done it, and he had not, and here was the difference. He sat with that for 6 weeks through January and into February while the cattle numbers continued to fall and the flour in the kitchen ran toward the last sack, and Dorothea tried to manage the household on what remained with a competence he had not known she possessed. On the morning of March 4th, Reginald Winslow wrote 2 letters, one to his banker in Helena, one to Dorothea. The letter to Dorothea said, "I knew the widow was right. I gave the order and didn't see it done. I built everything on what I owned and nothing on what I knew. Take the children to Boston when the roads open. Your family there will help. I am sorry I was not the man I should have been." He left both letters on the desk. He did not come to supper that evening. Dorothea did not tell Astrid about the letter on the morning she came for food in February. She was not ready to say it out loud yet, not even to herself, and certainly not to the woman whose preparation her husband had respected and whose example he had tried inadequately to follow. She told her 3 weeks later, on her 3rd visit to the cabin in late February, when the temperature had finally crept up to 10 below and felt almost mild by comparison. She said it plainly the way she had learned to say difficult things since November, without cushioning or softening. She said, "Reginald is gone. He died in March. He chose it." Astrid was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was not a stupid man." "No," Dorothea said, "he wasn't. That was what made it worse. He understood at the end exactly what he had done wrong." She looked at the fire. "He told me in his letter that he gave the order to prepare and didn't follow through himself. He delegated." She said the word as if it tasted wrong, "to a man whose interests were not the same as ours." Astrid said nothing to that. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set a cup in front of Dorothea and sat down across from her. They sat in silence for a while, 2 women on opposite sides of a winter that had made a certain kind of equality between them. Outside, the snow fell, softer now than it had been in December, a February snow rather than a January snow, but still falling, still accumulating, still adding to the 6 feet that already covered the valley. The pit beneath the floor held 240 pounds. Astrid looked at the trap door and thought about the family still coming, the rations still shrinking, the spring that was somewhere on the other side of the calendar, the spring that had not yet seen fit to arrive. She thought about Grandmother Sigrid's voice, steady and factual, across the table in September. "Sometimes it breaks in May." She got up and put another log on the fire. March came and winter did not notice. The calendar said spring was 6 weeks away. The thermometer said otherwise. The snow that had been falling since November continued to fall. Not always hard, not always with the violence of the January storms, but steadily, persistently, with the patience of something that has no reason to hurry. 2 inches on a Tuesday, 6 inches overnight on a Thursday. A week of gray skies that produced nothing, and then a weekend that produced 2 feet. The valley had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of December and January. December had been the quiet of shock, of people still believing that conditions would normalize, that the supply wagons would get through, that the ranches would hold, that Montana in 1886 was not Sweden in 1867, and things like this did not happen here. January had been the quiet of people beginning to understand that they were wrong. March was the quiet of people who had stopped expecting anything and were simply enduring. Astrid had 190 pounds of food in the pit. She knew this number the way she knew her own heartbeat, not by checking, but by continuous awareness, a running accounting that never fully left the back of her mind, regardless of what else she was doing. 190 pounds, she had started with 640. She had given away more than 400 pounds across 11 families since January, rationing each distribution, With the careful precision of a field surgeon, working with limited supplies, giving what people needed to survive without giving what they might prefer to have. She was eating 2 small meals a day now. A cup of bean soup in the morning, thick enough to have substance but measured to the half cup. A portion of dried venison in the evening, 3 ounces, sometimes 4, if she had done heavy work. She had stopped the preserved fruit entirely, keeping those jars for the families with children for the particular nutritional needs of bodies that were still growing. She was not comfortable. She was not dangerously hungry, not yet, but she was operating on less than her body wanted, and she could feel the difference. A heaviness in the mornings that had not been there in December. A slowness at the edges of her thinking when she had been up too long. The way cold felt different when you are not eating enough, more penetrating, less manageable, the body's heating system running on insufficient fuel. She did her arithmetic every morning and kept going. The Henderson family came on the first Thursday of March. There were 8 of them, Jacob and Clara. Henderson, 6 children, ranging from 14 years down to a boy who was not yet 2, a round-faced child with his mother's dark eyes, who had just learned to walk and did it with the particular lurching enthusiasm of someone newly in possession of a remarkable ability. Astrid had seen the Henderson family twice before in January and February. She recognized the children by now, knew their names, knew which of the older ones were steady and which was the one who got frightened easily. She knew that Jacob Henderson had frostbite in 2 fingers from December that had not fully healed, and that Clara Henderson was the kind of woman who underreported her own needs so consistently that you had to double whatever she said she required. She brought them inside. She put the pot on the stove for coffee, thin coffee, because the beans were running low but hot and something. She watched the children arrange themselves in the cabin, the way children arrange themselves in a warm space after being cold for too long, the older ones finding corners and the younger ones drifting toward the fire. The youngest, the boy who had just learned to walk, came toward Astrid with the unstudied directness of a child under 2, who has not yet learned that strangers require a certain careful approach. He grabbed the hem of her apron with both fists and looked up at her. His face was thin, not the natural thinness of a small child, but the acquired thinness of insufficient food. The cheeks slightly hollowed, the eyes slightly large in proportion, the look that Astrid had been seeing on children's faces since January, and that she recognized from the stories grandmother Sigrid had told about Sweden. She looked at him for a long moment. He had light hair, this child, and dark eyes, and he looked at her with the complete, uncomplicated attention that very young children give to things that interest them. She thought about the child she had lost in February of last year. The child she had never told anyone about, not even Lars before he died, the child who had been 4 months along when the storm came, and who had not survived the grief and the cold and the insufficient food of those last weeks of winter. She did not know if it had been a boy or a girl. She had not let herself think about that. She looked at this child holding her apron with both fists. She reached down and picked him up, which surprised him enough that he made a small sound of protest and then subsided, settling against her shoulder with the boneless trust of the very young. She held him for a moment, just a moment. Then she handed him back to Clara Henderson and went to the trap door and climbed down into the pit and stayed down there longer than necessary, standing in the cold dark with the smell of earth and preservation around her, doing the arithmetic one more time. 190 pounds. 8 people for 2 weeks required at minimum 40 pounds. She had 10 families in rotation. The math was not in her favor. The math had not been in her favor for 3 weeks, and she had been doing it anyway. She climbed back up. She gave the Hendersons 45 pounds. 5 pounds more than the calculation said. She wrapped the smoked venison in the better cloth, the cloth that would keep out moisture, on the 4-mile ride home. She tucked a jar of preserved pears into the bundle without noting it in the ledger. Clara Henderson saw her do it. "You're giving us more than you should," Clara said quietly while Jacob was loading the wagon and the older children were helping. Astrid tied the bundle closed. "He's not yet 2, she said. "He needs it more than the ledger does." Clara Henderson looked at her for a moment with an expression that Astrid did not try to interpret. Then she picked up her youngest son and carried him out to the wagon. April arrived on the calendar. The snow did not consult the calendar. There was a day in the first week of April when the temperature rose above freezing for the first time since November, a single day barely 40 degrees, and the snow on the south-facing slope above the cabin softened slightly and dripped from the eaves for a few hours in the afternoon. Astrid stood on the porch and felt the sun on her face, actual warmth, the first genuine warmth in 5 months, and let herself feel it without immediately qualifying it or measuring it against what still needed to happen. The next morning, it was 12 below again. She went inside and updated her ledger. 130 pounds. She had been eating one meal a day for 2 weeks. Not by plan, but by necessity, by the arithmetic that would not stop working itself out regardless of what she preferred. The bean soup in the morning, a portion of dried venison, when she had done enough work to justify it. She was not keeping careful count of her own consumption anymore because the careful count had become a negotiation. She was losing, and it was easier to simply eat what she ate and not record the number. She was thin. She could feel it in the looseness of her clothing, in the way the chair felt harder than it used to, in the clarity that insufficient food sometimes gives to the mind, even as it takes things from the body. A sharpness, a reduction of everything to its essential nature, the unnecessary falling away. She did not complain about this. There was no one to complain to, and complaining had never been part of how she understood the world. She kept her rounds. The families kept coming. She kept giving. The second week of April brought a storm that lasted 4 days. Not the monster storms of January, not the kind that split trees and drove the thermometer to 40 below, but a steady, determined snow that fell without hurrying and accumulated without apology, 2 feet in 4 days, replenishing the drifts that had softened slightly in the brief warmth of early April. She did not go out during the storm. She stayed in the cabin and tended the fire and ate her single meal each day and sat at the table with her ledger and did not open it because the number inside it was a number she already knew and did not need to see written down. 97 pounds. She had fallen below 100 pounds for the first time. She had started with 640. The distance between those numbers represented 5 months of feeding 11 families through the worst winter in Montana's recorded history, and she could trace every pound of the difference back to a specific family, a specific visit, a specific child's face, or a specific man's careful knock on her door. She did not regret any of it, but she sat in the cabin during those 4 days of storm and let herself be honest in the way you can only be honest with yourself in the dark, that she was frightened. Not the sharp, immediate fear of danger, but the slower fear of someone who can see the arithmetic clearly and understands what it means if spring does not come soon. Grandmother Sigrid had said 7 months. 7 months from November was June. It was the second week of April. She could not feed 11 families on 97 pounds until June. She put another log on the fire and ate her cup of bean soup and did not open the ledger and went to sleep. The storm broke on a Friday. She woke to silence of a different quality than the silence of the past 4 days, a silence that was still and clear rather than muffled and pressing, and she knew before she looked out the window that the sky had changed. She got up and went to the window, and there it was, the thin, cold blue of a sky that had stopped producing weather. The sun already an hour above the ridge, the snow on the south slope starting to glitter, the way snow glitters when the temperature is rising rather than falling. Not warm, not spring, but different. She dressed and went outside and stood on the porch in the cold, clear air and looked at the valley below her. The snow stretched in every direction, still 6 feet deep in the flat ground, still drifted to the roof lines in the places where the wind had concentrated. It's still entirely covering everything that had been green in October. But the air was different. She could not have said exactly how. Something in the quality of the light, something in the way the cold sat against her skin, a slight yielding in it, the first fractional easing of the long pressure. She went back inside and ate her morning soup and opened the ledger. 97 pounds. 10 families still in rotation. The arithmetic still not in her favor. She closed the ledger. She had done what she had decided to do. She would keep doing it until she could not, and then she would see. Dorothea Winslow came on the third Tuesday of April. She had been coming every 2 weeks since February, riding the 4 miles from the Winslow property on horseback, always arriving in the late morning, always with the same careful knock on the door that was different from the knock she had given in June in another life, when she had stood at the edge of the excavation in her Boston dress and found the whole enterprise amusing. She was not the same woman who had come in February either. 2 months of crisis does something to a person, something that cannot be undone when the crisis is over, a permanent alteration in the understanding of what the world actually is and what it is capable of. She was thinner. She sat straighter. She helped with the bundling without being asked. Astrid gave her 20 pounds this visit, less than before. The number was getting small enough that she had to be more careful. Dorothea looked at the bundle and then at Astrid and did not say anything about the reduced amount, which told Astrid that Dorothea Winslow understood more than she let on about how close the arithmetic was running. "My children ask about you," Dorothea said while Astrid tied the bundle. Astrid looked up. "They want to know who the woman is, who gave us food. The youngest one, my daughter Vera, she asks if you're a witch." Dorothea's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "I told her you're the most sensible woman in Montana." Astrid tied the last knot. "Tell Vera I'm a farmer," she said. "That's all." Dorothea took the bundle and stood for a moment at the door. "I owe you something. I don't know how to repay," she said. Astrid had thought about this in the long, quiet evenings by the fire, what she wanted from Dorothea Winslow when spring came and the world returned to something like itself. What repayment looked like between people who had been on opposite sides of a winter that had reshaped everything. She had arrived at an answer. "Don't repay me," she said. "Dig a pit, store food. When next winter comes, be ready. And if your neighbor is not ready, give what you can." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "That's what you want. That's what I want," Astrid said. Dorothea went out into the April cold and mounted her horse and rode back down the track toward the road. Astrid watched her go from the doorway, 63 pounds left in the pit. She closed the door. May 3rd, 1887. She woke to the sound of water, not the drip from the eaves that had come briefly in early April, and then stopped. Something more sustained, more genuine, a continuous sound of moving water that meant something fundamental had changed in the night. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, making sure she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. Then she got up. She went to the door and opened it, and the air that came in was cold, but not the killing cold of winter. It was the cold of early morning in a season that had not quite decided to be warm yet, but had given up on being brutal. The sky to the east was the particular pale gold of a May sunrise, clear and clean, without the gray weight of storm clouds. And the snow was moving. Not dramatically. Not the sudden dramatic melt of a late spring thaw, but the edges of the drifts had softened overnight, and where the sunlight hit the south-facing slopes, the top layer was already crystalline and wet, rather than hard and dry, and in the low places at the field's edge, where drainage gathered, there was a thin glitter of running water, finding its way. 7 months. November 9th to May 3rd. She counted it out in her head the way she had been doing since December. 7 months nearly to the day. The number that grandmother Sigrid had given her in September, not as a certainty but as a fact of history, a thing that had happened once in Sweden and could therefore happen anywhere that winter came. It had happened here. She stood on the porch and looked out at the beginning of the end of the winter that had tried to outlast everything and had not quite managed it, though. The snow was still deep. The road was still impassable. It would be weeks before the valley was fully clear, before the mud season that followed a heavy snow gave way to something a person could plant in. But it was May. It was May, and she was standing on her porch, and she was alive. She opened the ledger for the last time that winter on the morning of May 3rd and wrote the final number. 41 pounds. 41 pounds remaining from 640. She had given away nearly 600 pounds of food over 5 months. She had fed 11 families through a winter that had killed 50,000 head of cattle and bankrupted the ranchers who had owned them and driven families off land they had spent a decade building. She had done it on arithmetic and discipline, and the knowledge that her grandmother had given her across the table in the old country, the knowledge that winter does not care about your expectations, that the only protection against a world that can turn lethal without warning is preparation done in advance by your own hands, not delegated, not assumed, not trusted to someone else, or to the market, or to civilization, or to providence. She had done it, and it had cost her almost everything she had stored, and she was thin and tired in a way that would take weeks to fully recover from, and she did not regret a single pound of it. She closed the ledger. The valley came back to life slowly, the way things come back to life, after a winter that has been genuinely trying to kill them, rather than simply inconveniencing them. The snow retreated by degrees through May 1st from the south, facing slopes, then from the flat ground, then from the north-facing draws that held on to winter longer than anywhere else, the places where snow could survive into June in a bad year. The roads opened. The mud season that followed the melt was deep and treacherous, the ground saturated beyond its capacity, every low spot a potential bog, every track a test of patience and horsepower. But things moved again. People moved again. The accounting of what winter had done to the valley took weeks to complete and was worse than even the most pessimistic estimates of December had suggested. The cattle losses across Montana's grazing ranges ran to the hundreds of thousands. In some districts, 90% of the herds were gone dead in the fields, frozen or starved, or both. Ranchers who had been wealthy in October were bankrupt by May. The banks that had lent them money were in trouble. The merchants who had extended credit were calculating losses they could not absorb. The great die-up people were already starting to call it, though that name would take a few more months to settle into common usage. The winter that ended the open range era, the winter that proved that Montana's grazing lands could not sustain unlimited cattle through an unlimited winter, the winter that rewrote the arithmetic of ranching in the American West. Astrid planted her garden on May 20th. The ground was still cold, 4 inches down, cold enough to make her wonder if she was planting too early, but she had been watching the soil temperature for 2 weeks and she knew it was close enough. She planted potatoes first, pressing each seed piece into the earth with the practiced motion of someone who has done this enough times that the body knows the right depth without measuring. She planted alone the way she had planted alone the previous summer, but the quality of the aloneness was different. Last summer, she had been alone with urgency, with the arithmetic of survival pressing at her from every direction, with the knowledge of what Lars's death had meant and what the baby's death had meant and what winter could do when you were not ready for it. This spring, she was alone with something quieter, something that was not quite peace, not yet, but was in the direction of peace. The knowledge that she had been tested by the worst that this valley could produce and had not broken. Had bent certainly, had eaten 2 spoonfuls of beans a day and worn her clothes loose and felt the cold more than she should have felt it. Had stood at the trap door in February and thought about closing it and had not closed it. Had not closed it. She pressed another seed potato into the earth and moved down the row. Dorothea Winslow came in the last week of May, not on horseback this time, on foot, walking the 4 miles from the Winslow property on a road that was muddy but passable, arriving at Astrid's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was actually warm enough to feel on the back of your hands. She looked different from the woman who had come in February. The thinness was still there. It would take months to fully resolve, but there was color in her face that had not been there in winter, and she walked with a directness that the drawing room Dorothea of June 1886 had not possessed. She sat at Astrid's table and accepted a cup of coffee. Real coffee this time, purchased last week from Walter Pruitt's store in Meridian, and she said what she had come to say. "I'm taking my children to Boston," she said. "I can't face another winter like that one." She looked at the table at the grain of the wood. "Reginald's family will help us. I have some money from the sale of the property, enough to get established." She looked up. "I'm not the right kind of person for this country. I understand that now." Astrid said nothing, waiting. "I thought civilization was something you carried with you," Dorothea said. "Something that arrived when you arrived and made the place safe and manageable. I thought the trains and the banks and the social order meant that the frontier was over, that we were past the time when the land could just undo everything you'd built." She looked out the window at the valley, at the mud and the retreating snow and the fields that would need months to recover. "It undid everything," she said. "Everything Reginald built. Everything I thought I knew." She paused. "Everything except what you built, what you put in that hole in the ground." Astrid poured more coffee. "You kept your children alive," she said. "That's not nothing." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "I kept them alive because you fed them," she said. "Let's be honest about that. You came back. Every 2 weeks through February and March and April, you came back and you asked for what your children needed." Astrid looked at her. "Some people are too proud to do that. You were not." Dorothea seemed to consider this. It was not the absolution she had perhaps expected, but it was accurate, and Dorothea Winslow, stripped of the social architecture that had once given her shape, turned out to be a woman who preferred accuracy to comfort. "What will you do?" Dorothea asked. "Will you stay?" Astrid looked out the window at the garden she had planted 3 days ago, the rows of disturbed earth that held nothing visible yet, but that she knew were already doing what seeds do in soil and warmth and water. the invisible work that precedes everything. I'll stay, she said. I'll plant. I'll build the stores back up. Dorothea nodded. Next year, she said. You'll be ready again. Next year, Astrid said. And the year after. And every year until I'm too old to dig. Dorothea finished her coffee and stood up. She looked around the cabin one last time at the rafters, where the smoked meat had hung all winter, at the shelves, where the jars had stood in rows at the trap door in the floor. I'll tell my children about you, she said. When they're grown, I'll tell them there was a woman in Montana who knew something everyone else refused to know and who fed 11 families because she had done the work that everyone else refused to do. She paused at the door. I told everyone you were crazy, she said. I want to say clearly before I go that I was wrong. You were the only sane person in this valley. Astrid walked her to the door and stood on the porch and watched her start back down the track toward the road. She walked steadily, Dorothea Winslow, with the mud of Montana on her sensible boots, and 4 miles between her and home, and no carriage to carry her. She did not look back. Astrid watched until she reached the curve in the track where the cottonwoods began, and then went back inside. Grandmother Sigrid died that summer. The news came in a letter from her son, near Helena, written in the careful English of a man who had learned the language as an adult and had never fully trusted it. She died in July in her sleep in the cabin where she had spent the last years of her life. She was 84 years old. She had not been ill. She had simply, as her son put it, decided she was finished. Astrid read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered. She thought about the old woman's hands twisted with decades of work, feeling the cold air rising from the pit in September, and knowing immediately what it meant, what kind of preparation it represented, what kind of mind had conceived it. She thought about the table and the lamplight, and the voice that was matter-of-fact even when the content was terrible, because some people learn early that facts are more useful than feelings, and they organize themselves accordingly. She thought about the thing Grandmother Sigrid had given her that September evening, which was not just information or confirmation, or even the weight of historical witness. It was something simpler and more durable. She had been seen by someone who understood. There are not many things more valuable than that. The families who had come to Astrid's door that winter did not forget what she had given them. The Millers planted a larger garden in 1887, not as large as Astrid's, not with the same systematic intensity, but larger than they had ever planted before, and Jacob Miller spent 2 weeks in July building a proper root cellar under the barn floor 8 feet deep, lined with straw, the way he had heard the Swedish widow had built hers. The Petersons put up 3 times the preserved food they had put up in previous years. Clara Peterson drove 4 miles to ask Astrid about smoking meat, and Astrid showed her what she knew standing in the small smokehouse behind the cabin while the smoke curled up through the rough hole and the venison hung in rows on the racks. The family whose name Astrid had never known turned out to be the Gundersons, she learned in May when they came back to return the cloth she had used to wrap their food bundles clean and folded. Thomas Gunderson was a quiet man who worked hard and said little, and what he said when he came to return the cloth was, "We'll be ready next year." Astrid took the cloth and said, "I know you will." This was the thing she had not planned on, had not included in any of her arithmetic. Not because she hadn't thought about it, but because it was not the kind of thing you could calculate in advance. The effect of demonstration. The way people change not when you argue with them or shame them or explain yourself to them, but when they watch you do the thing and survive when doing it, and they understand in their bodies, in the deep wordless part of a person that knows, before the mind catches up, that the thing works. She had not set out to teach anyone anything. She had set out to survive. But the surviving done visibly, done generously, done with the pit open to whoever needed it through the worst winter the valley had seen, had taught more than any argument could have. Gunnar Kalgren came in June. He was a farmer from the north end of the valley, a Swedish-American like Astrid, which was where the similarity to Lars ended. He was quieter than Lars, more careful, a man who spent more time looking at things than talking about them. He had survived the winter on his own stores, which he had built through the summer of 1886, with a thoroughness that was Astrid learned entirely. His own independent conclusion arrived at the same way she had arrived at hers. He had lost his wife 3 years earlier, not to winter, but to a fever in August, one of those summer fevers that come without warning and take people who had seemed entirely healthy the week before. He had two sons, 7 and 9 quiet boys, who looked like their father. He came not with a social call in mind, but with a practical one. He had heard she was rebuilding her stores. He had 300 pounds of potatoes from his own harvest to trade and wondered if she had smoked venison she might exchange. She did. They stood in her cabin and worked out the exchange with the businesslike directness of two people who respect each other's time. He had heard what she had done that winter. She had heard through the valley grapevine that he was one of the few farmers in the North End who had made it through without asking anyone for food. They were not the same kind of quiet. His was the quiet of a man who had learned that most of what people say is not worth hearing. Hers was the quiet of a woman who had learned that action was the only language that meant anything. But the quiets were compatible. He came back in July to help with the smokehouse roof, which had been weakened by the weight of snow and needed new timber. He came without being asked, with the timber already cut, measuring the repair with his eye before he asked permission to do it. She gave permission. He fixed the roof in a day. He ate supper at her table. They talked about the next winter's preparation, about the specific varieties of potato that stored best, about the depth at which the Montana clay maintained its temperature most reliably. He came back in August and September. In October, he asked if she would consider marrying him. She considered it for a week, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned to be careful about decisions that could not be undone, and this was one of those decisions. She said yes on a Sunday afternoon in October, while they were both standing in her root cellar assessing the new season's stores, surrounded by the smell of earth and preservation and the evidence of work done correctly. It seemed like the right place to make a decision of that kind. They married in November 1889 at the Lutheran Church in Meridian. The ceremony was small. The families who had come to Astrid's door during the winter were there: the Millers and the Petersons and the Gundersons, the people she had fed and who had not forgotten it. Ruth Hanson, who had thought she was working too hard in the summer of 1886 and had said nothing about it since and had not needed to. Reverend Albrecht, who had preached the sermon about trusting Providence in August of 1886, married them with a solemnity that suggested a man who had done some revising of his theological positions over the intervening 3 years. Together they built what she had designed alone. They bought the 40 acres adjacent to her original claim and broke new ground for a larger garden. They deepened the root cellar and widened it and lined it with better timber, bringing its capacity to 2,000 pounds. They built a second smokehouse, larger than the first, with better airflow and better capacity for the kind of systematic smoking that filled a root cellar properly. 2,000 pounds, enough for a year if necessary, and enough for 2 if they were careful, enough to share meaningfully with anyone who came to the door when winter turned serious. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and they raised them the way both of them had been raised in Sweden, in the deep tradition of people who understand that the world's comfort is not guaranteed, that warmth and food are not the default state of things, but something that must be created and maintained and stored against the seasons that want to take them from you. The children learned the arithmetic before they learned anything else. How many pounds per person per month? What stores well and what doesn't? How to build a smokehouse and what temperature the clay holds at 8 feet, and how to read the October sky for what November intends to do. They learned it not as history, but as practice, as the living knowledge that keeps people alive, the knowledge that goes in the hands and the muscles and the calculating mind and stays there. The cabin where Astrid had buried 640 pounds of food under the floor stood until 1923. It had been added to over the years, rooms built onto the original structure. As the family grew, the original single room becoming the core of something larger and more complicated. The root cellar beneath the original floor had eventually been supplemented by the larger cellar under the new construction, and the old pit had gone out of regular use sometime around 1910, no longer necessary when there was the larger and more accessible space next door. When the original cabin was finally torn down in 1923 to make way for a new farmhouse, the workers found the old pit still intact beneath the original floor. 8 feet deep, lined with straw and sawdust and wooden planks that had held up through 37 years. The straw had compressed. The planks had darkened with age. But the structure was sound, the work of a woman who had built it to last, because she had understood that what you build for survival needs to be built seriously. The workers stood at the edge of the opening and looked down into the dark. They were young men born after the winter of 1886 who had grown up in a Montana that remembered that winter as history rather than experience. They had heard the story, most of them. Everyone in the valley had heard the story. The Swedish widow who had stored food in a pit under her floor and fed 11 families through the worst winter in the territory's history, while the ranchers who had laughed at her went broke and their cattle froze in the fields. They stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. Then they filled it in with dirt and built a new farmhouse over it. But the story did not go into the ground with the pit. It moved the way stories move when they are attached to something real, to actual events with actual consequences that actual people can trace back through their own family histories. It was told at the Colgren table at Christmas and at harvest and at the funerals where the family gathered and remembered the people who had come before. It was told by Astrid's children to their children and by those children to their own. Not as a legend, not as the kind of story that grows larger and more improbable with each retelling, as a practical account of what one woman had done and why it had worked and what it meant for the people who came after her. She had seen what winter could do. She had done the arithmetic. She had built the storage. She had given until the pit was nearly empty, not because she was not frightened, not because the numbers were comfortable, but because she knew who she was, and she had decided alone at her table on a February night, with the fire burning and the cold pressing against the walls, that she was not the kind of person who closes the trap door when people are hungry on the other side of it. She had survived, not because she was lucky, not because the winter was merciful, not because civilization provided, or the trains got through, or the neighbors were ready to help, because she had spent a summer digging a hole and filling it with everything she could put away, doing the work herself, checking the numbers, herself trusting nothing but what she had done with her own hands in the months when the doing was possible. The ones who survived, her children, told their children, were not the luckiest. They were the most prepared. And the preparation, they said, is not something you begin when winter arrives. It is something you do in June, when the ground is warm and the days are long and everyone else is telling you that you are being foolish, that you are working too hard, that civilization will provide, that the trains are running and the markets are open, and nothing that bad could happen here. You do it in June. You do it while the sun is still warm on your back and the soil turns dark and rich under the spade, and the summer stretches out ahead of you like it will never end. Because it will end. It always ends. And what you put in the ground in June is what keeps you alive in February. That was the lesson. That was what Astrid Kalgren put in the ground, along with the potatoes and the turnips and the carrots and the dried beans and the smoked venison and the preserved fruit and the pickled cabbage. A lesson that kept.